Hi, I'm Michael Wyetzner. I've spent more than 35 years working as an architect in New York City, and today we're going to explore three remarkable New York buildings that no longer exist. We'll look at what made them so special and discover what stands in their place today. Let's begin with one of the most famous buildings ever constructed in New York, the original Pennsylvania Station, better known as Penn Station. The first thing that immediately catches my attention is its magnificent main facade facing 7th Avenue. On both the north and south sides are grand entrances crowned with pediments, designed specifically for automobiles to pass through. Right in the center sits the primary entrance for pedestrians, marked by 6 massive Doric columns supporting a simple horizontal entablature, with a decorative medallion placed above it. In fact, every column on the facade follows the Doric order, the simplest and oldest of the classical Greek architectural styles. Even the spacing between these columns wasn't random, it was carefully modeled after Gian Lorenzo Bernini's famous Piazza in Rome, showing just how deeply the architects were inspired by classical European design. The entire station was created in the Beaux-Arts architectural style, a style that traces its roots back to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which was the most prestigious and influential school of architecture in the world at that time. Beaux-Arts architecture drew heavily from history, especially the classical traditions of ancient Greece and Rome. One of the clearest examples of this inspiration can be seen in the station's enormous waiting room, which rose above the rest of the building. Its design was directly inspired by the ancient baths of Caracalla in Rome, borrowing their monumental scale and timeless elegance. Penn Station was completed in 1910 by the legendary architectural firm McKim, Mead & White. During America's Gilded Age, they were considered the architects everyone wanted to hire. Their portfolio included some of New York's most celebrated landmarks, many of which still stand today, including the Washington Square Arch, the library at Columbia University, and the library at New York University in the Bronx, which now serves as Bronx Community College. But Penn Station wasn't just an architectural masterpiece, it was also an extraordinary engineering achievement. To make the station possible, engineers first had to solve a problem that had never been conquered before: building tunnels beneath the Hudson River. Before Penn Station existed, there were no rail tunnels connecting New Jersey directly to Manhattan. Train passengers had to end their journey in Jersey City, get off the train, and board a ferry to cross the Hudson River before finally reaching New York City. Penn Station changed everything. For the first time, passengers could travel directly into Manhattan and arrive inside an incredibly grand and beautifully decorated transportation hub unlike anything they had ever experienced. Penn Station interiors. Now let's step inside and take a closer look at the station's breathtaking interior. The images show two different parts of the building. On the left is the enormous waiting room, while on the right is the train shed, where travelers would descend to the platforms below to board their trains. One of the first features that stands out is the spectacular vaulted ceiling in the waiting room, covered with beautifully crafted coffers. Looking at the train shed beside it, you immediately notice a similar architectural form. Instead of being built from stone, however, these vaults were constructed with steel. Although the materials are different, the overall design language remains the same. The waiting room's stone ceiling is decorated with deep square coffers, while the steel roof of the train shed replaces those coffers with countless small panes of glass, creating massive skylights that flood the space with natural daylight. In both structures, elegant groin vaults stretch overhead, giving the station a remarkable sense of unity. Looking directly into the waiting room, you can clearly see the enormous entrances connecting 7th and 8th Avenues. At both ends of the hall, stairways lead toward 33rd Street and 31st Street, while towering clerestory windows allow sunlight to pour deep into the interior. The magnificent coffered ceiling itself was built from travertine, a beautiful natural stone quarried in Tivoli, just outside Rome. Interestingly, this is the very same type of stone the ancient Romans used thousands of years earlier to build the Colosseum. But perhaps the most unforgettable feature of the waiting room is its incredible scale. Just compare the size of the people standing inside to the vast dimensions of the hall around them. The room feels enormous, open, bright, and awe-inspiring. When it was completed, it wasn't simply one of the greatest interior spaces in New York City, it was widely considered one of the most magnificent public spaces anywhere in the world. As passengers stepped off their trains and made their way up into the station, the very first thing they encountered was the breathtaking skylit train shed. Its design was heavily inspired by the great railway stations of Europe, giving travelers an unforgettable first impression. Even though the train shed was built from steel and the central waiting room was enclosed in stone, the two spaces shared remarkably similar architectural forms. The sweeping vaults echoed one another, creating a sense of harmony throughout the station. What's especially fascinating is the engineering behind all that steel. When Penn Station was completed in 1910, it represented some of the most advanced construction technology in the world. Every column, beam, and arch wasn't made from a single solid piece. Instead, each structural element was assembled from many smaller steel components that were carefully riveted together. Those countless rivets created a delicate, lace-like framework that was not only incredibly strong but also surprisingly elegant. But perhaps the most surprising fact is that these two parts of the station were even more alike than they appeared. The magnificent stone waiting room was, in a sense, an illusion. The stone itself wasn't carrying the weight of the building. Hidden behind it was a steel skeleton doing all the structural work. In fact, it was essentially the very same steel framework that supported the enormous train shed stretching toward 8th Avenue. Another remarkable aspect of Penn Station was who actually built it. It wasn't funded by the federal government. It wasn't constructed by New York City or even the state. Instead, the entire project was built by a private company. The Pennsylvania Railroad owned the land, owned the station itself, and that ownership would eventually play a major role in the building's fate. Sadly, Penn Station survived for only about 50 years. As rail travel declined, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company found itself on the edge of bankruptcy. In order to stay afloat financially, the company had no choice but to sell the property to a real estate developer. That decision sealed the station's fate. The magnificent building was demolished. It's especially tragic because, although Penn Station had fallen on difficult times and years of declining maintenance had taken their toll, it was still considered one of the greatest architectural achievements in New York City. Unfortunately, it became the sacrifice that made way for redevelopment. Ironically, its destruction ended up changing history. The public outrage over the demolition of Penn Station sparked the beginning of New York City's landmark preservation movement. It eventually led to the creation of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, ensuring that buildings of extraordinary historical and architectural value would receive legal protection. Today, a building like Penn Station would almost certainly never be allowed to be torn down. In fact, the preservation laws created in response to its destruction later helped save another New York icon just a few blocks away, Grand Central Terminal. An announcer at the time summed up the moment: New York's Pennsylvania Railroad Station has reached the end of the line. A landmark for tourists and natives alike, the massive granite monument to an age of elegance is now falling to the wrecking crews. Organized efforts tried to save what architects considered one of America's greatest designs. While the Underground Railroad tracks will remain, the station itself, with its famous clock, will be replaced by a modern sports arena, marking the end of a true landmark. Penn Station was finally demolished in 1963. Today, the place where its magnificent train shed and grand waiting room once stood is occupied by the modern Madison Square Garden, which is actually the fourth version of the famous arena. Madison Square Garden. Before looking at today's building, it's worth visiting the most iconic version of Madison Square Garden, the second incarnation, built on its original site. The very first Madison Square Garden was constructed during the 1870s. The version we're focusing on today was built in the 1890s by the same legendary architectural firm responsible for Penn Station, McKim, Mead and White. This particular project, however, was designed by Charles McKim's partner, Stanford White. Stanford White didn't just design the building. He actually lived there, and, remarkably, he also died there, a story we'll return to a little later. In the image on the right, we're viewing the building from Madison Square, looking toward the northeast. The image on the left shows Park Avenue in the foreground, while Madison Avenue can be seen farther away along 26th Street. Several architectural details immediately stand out. The building is designed in the Renaissance Revival style and constructed from warm buff-colored brick, a material Stanford White particularly loved using in his projects. Along the ground floor, he created a beautiful arcade, allowing visitors to stand under shelter while waiting to purchase tickets. Above that sits a graceful loggia. A loggia is closely related to an arcade, but instead of a series of Renaissance arches like those below, it features rows of columns supporting a flat entablature. Above the entablature is a decorative balustrade. At the building's corners, Stanford White added elegant domed turrets. He also placed matching turrets halfway along the block, framing the main entrance and giving the building a strong sense of balance. Looking more closely at the image on the left, you can also see the extensive terracotta ornamentation. Decorative terracotta frames surround the blind windows on the corner turrets, adding texture and richness to the exterior. The left-hand image also provides an excellent sense of the building's enormous scale. The structure stretches from Park Avenue in the foreground, where the trolley tracks are clearly visible, all the way across to Madison Avenue in the distance. In other words, Madison Square Garden occupied an entire New York City block. Inside, the main arena hosted an extraordinary variety of events. It welcomed presidential political conventions, circus performances, boxing matches, and even featured a velodrome where bicycle races were held. One especially innovative feature of the arena was its sliding skylight. For a building constructed in the 1890s, this was an impressive technological luxury, allowing fresh air and natural light to enter the arena whenever needed. Perhaps the building's most recognizable feature, however, was its magnificent tower. That tower was directly inspired by the Giralda Campanile of the Cathedral of Seville in Spain. In fact, the entire design reflected Stanford White's deep admiration for Spanish architecture, which served as one of the primary inspirations behind this unforgettable version of Madison Square Garden. Stanford White wanted the tower to serve as a giant landmark, a visual signpost that people could easily recognize on New York City's skyline. At the same time, he had another goal in mind. He wanted the tower to rival Joseph Pulitzer's famous New York World newspaper building at Park Row, which was then competing for the title of the tallest building in New York City. To make his tower stand out even more, White crowned it with a statue of the huntress Diana. What makes this choice especially fascinating is the symbolism behind it. The tower itself was inspired by the bell tower of a cathedral in Spain. While the original cathedral tower was built to honor God and represent religion, Stanford White placed a nude statue of Diana on top of his version, transforming it into a celebration of pleasure, entertainment, and worldly enjoyment. Not everyone supported the idea. The building's investors strongly opposed constructing the tower, and White had to fight hard to convince them to include it in the final design. Ironically, once the tower was finished, no one knew exactly how it should be used. Eventually, the owners decided to turn the upper levels into rental apartments to generate additional income. Stanford White himself rented one of those apartments and stayed there whenever his family was away. His connection to the building, however, ended in tragedy. Not only did he live there, but he was also murdered there. At the very top of the building, hidden behind the elegant arcade, was the famous rooftop garden. It functioned as an open-air restaurant and cafe where guests could enjoy meals while watching live entertainment. It was there, in 1906, that Stanford White was shot and killed by the husband of a woman with whom he had been having an affair. Like many ambitious projects of its era, this version of Madison Square Garden struggled financially. Eventually, it could no longer support itself and was demolished during the 1920s. In its place rose the New York Life Insurance Building, which still stands on the site today. New York Herald Building. Now let's move on to another remarkable building, one that also sought to compete with Joseph Pulitzer's New York World Building. Once again, the architect was Stanford White. This time, the project was the New York Herald Building. The first thing that immediately stands out is the building's surroundings. On the right side, you can see the elevated railway running along 6th Avenue, which formed the building's eastern edge. On the left is Broadway, busy with trolley cars moving through the street. Looking at the main entrance facade, White designed a recessed entrance tucked beneath a grand arcade. Interestingly, the entrance itself follows a somewhat semicircular plan. Above it sits a pair of large arched windows. Higher still are the famous bell ringers, sculptures representing printing press workers, along with a statue of Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom. Another striking feature is the rich terracotta ornamentation placed between the windows, adding warmth and detail across the facade. The roof is equally distinctive. It features a hip roof with a flat central section, a solution that perfectly accommodated the unusual trapezoidal shape of the site. The arcade itself rests upon a raised platform known as a stylobate, an architectural feature commonly found in ancient Greek temples. Stanford White also designed a generous public plaza directly in front of the building. That plaza still exists today and is known as Herald Square. The New York Herald newspaper had originally been founded by James Gordon Bennett, before being inherited by his son, James Gordon Bennett Jr. Bennett Jr. recognized that New York City was steadily expanding northward. Up until that time, nearly every major newspaper was headquartered on Park Row beside City Hall in Lower Manhattan. Rather than staying downtown, Bennett decided to move his newspaper farther north to the intersection of Broadway and 6th Avenue, where they crossed 36th Street. The headquarters occupied a distinctive wedge-shaped site at what is now Herald Square. James Gordon Bennett Jr. already knew Stanford White through Newport, Rhode Island, where many of America's wealthiest families spent their summers around the turn of the 20th century. White had previously designed the interiors of Bennett's luxury yacht. Impressed by that work, Bennett hired him to design the new headquarters for his newspaper. Architecturally, the building wasn't merely inspired by the Loggia del Consiglio in Verona, it was, in many ways, an almost direct replica. The Loggia del Consiglio is a Venetian Renaissance palace built in 1476. Its own design was inspired by the Foundling Hospital created by Filippo Brunelleschi in Florence during the 1420s. On the original Loggia del Consiglio, statues stand above each pilaster along the roofline. Stanford White chose to replace those statues with owls. This was done at James Gordon Bennett Jr.'s request because he believed owls symbolized the wisdom and intelligence of his newspaper. White even gave the owls glowing eyes by placing green electric light bulbs inside them. At night, the illuminated eyes created an unforgettable sight. Sadly, the New York Herald building was completely demolished by 1930. Even so, parts of it survive today in Herald Square. Visitors can still see the statue of Minerva, the bell ringers, and several of the original owl sculptures that once decorated the building. Unlike the previous landmarks we've discussed, which were replaced by buildings that became icons in their own right, the New York Herald building met a far less inspiring fate. Its replacement is an ordinary office building. Today, the ground floor is simply leased to a bank and a drugstore. We've now explored three extraordinary buildings designed by the legendary firm McKim, Mead & White that no longer exist. Their disappearance reflects the mindset that dominated New York City at the turn of the 20th century. Back then, progress was considered more important than preservation. Old buildings were routinely demolished to make way for new development, with little thought given to their historical or architectural significance. Had New York taken a stronger interest in protecting its architectural heritage, especially during the 1960s, when Penn Station was destroyed, many of these remarkable buildings might still be standing today. As the New York Times famously wrote after Penn Station's demolition, ultimately we are judged not by the monuments we create, but by those we have destroyed. So, which other iconic demolished buildings would you like to see explored next? Let me know in the comments below.